All right, so as events are unfolding in Hawaii, you also have events unfolding in the Caribbean, in Cuba. A rebellion is broken out in Cuba, and while there wasn't a lot of official support for the rebellion, there was a lot of popular support in America for the Cuban rebellion because it kind of calls to mind images of our own revolution against an imperialist power. The Cubans, in this case, are fighting the Spanish. Um, Sympathy was also roused when revelations came that the Spanish commander in Cuba was herding people into concentration camps, essentially, within Cuba. They were often disease ridden, malnutrition was rampant, and the conditions just generally horrible. These the sympathy of Americans, is also fueled by rampant competition between two newspapers. The New York Journal and the New York World, and they're running competing stories, all detailing Spanish atrocities, which is kicking Americans up into something of a frenzy. Um, in 1897, a new and much more liberal Spanish government comes into play, and they seek a peaceful resolution to the Cuban crisis. But the journalists don't back down, and they continue to inflame the public and even go so far as insulting McKinley as being weak because he's attempting to seek some kind of diplomatic solution to this problem. The pot really turns to boiling in February. On February 15th, a U.S. battleship moored in Havana Harbor, the Maine, explodes somewhat inexplicably. Even today, scholars are not entirely sure as to what sank the Maine, but in 1998, a study concluded that it was a mine that most likely set off ammunition, which exploded and sank the ship. The same conclusion was reached yet again by those newspapers, and American passions become extremely inflamed as a result. Despite the Spanish government making further concessions to the United States, McKinley ultimately, and perhaps somewhat reluctantly, sends his war message to Congress on April 11th, and they enact a joint resolution recognizing Cuba's independence and authorizing the use of force to expel the Spanish. Included in this is an item called the Teller Amendment, which basically was the U.S. renouncing any sort of territorial claim to Cuba. And so it made us look really good, even if we don't ultimately keep to it in its entirety. Now, we have a Spanish-American War ultimately fought over Cuba, but the first action in the Spanish-American War actually takes place in the Philippines. On May 1st of 1898, the U.S. fleet, commanded by George Dewey, steams into Manila Bay in the Philippines and attacks and destroys or captures all 10 of the Spanish ships anchored there. Only one American lost his life in that encounter, and later Dewey receives orders saying to occupy the city, so he moves troops in and they occupy Manila. While that's going on, you actually do see action in Cuba as well. The Americans needed to find the Spanish, and they were eventually spotted around Santiago. And so the American fleet steams into Santiago and very quickly blockades the harbor, trapping 7 Spanish battleships with 7 U.S. battleships and cruisers. On July 1st, you see the commencement of land action around Santiago, and that's when we get the fabled charge at San Juan Hill by Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. But by July 3rd, the land action is pretty much over. The Spanish make one last-ditch effort to break through the American blockade, but the U.S. Navy ships fire and sink the Spanish vessels, and ultimately that is the end of it. Secretary of State John Hay, in a letter to Theodore Roosevelt, describes the war as a splendid little war. But for many on the ground, the war was not quite so splendid. Most of the U.S. Army was very ill-trained and very poorly equipped. Most of them were volunteers. And a lot of them were going into battle in July, sort of the height of the summer, and they had woolen winter uniforms, so it was fairly miserable. They also lacked adequate medical support among the U.S. troops in the Spanish-American War. Nearly 380 American soldiers lost their lives in combat, but more than 5,000 succumbed to things like food poisoning, yellow fever, malaria, other diseases during and after the war. You also have, during the Spanish-American War, several African-American units and troops who participate in the war. Some of them were seasoned regular Army, Buffalo soldiers. Others of them, most of them, were volunteers from various states, and they all met at assembly points in the South, because it's obviously the easiest way to get to Cuba. Soldiers who are coming from northern states are having their first experiences with the sort of Jim Crow South, and this all kind of comes to a head in June as they're waiting for their orders to depart. On June 6th, after weeks of racist treatment, one group of black troops sort of explodes in riotous rage. They storm bars and restaurants and stores and other places that had barred them from entering, and it actually requires the intervention of white soldiers to calm the city down. They do sail to Cuba, and they sail to Cuba on the same troop transport ships as white soldiers, but the ships themselves are very strictly segregated, with the black soldiers most often forced on the lower decks, which are hot and smelly and just generally miserable. Despite the racism and hardship, many of these African-American soldiers do serve with distinction. The Spanish, the actual fighting only lasts maybe about half a month, a few weeks at the most, and the Spanish seek an armistice officially on July 17th. In that agreement, the Spanish recognize Cuba's independence, and after the U.S. pays about $20 million, they give us control of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. So now all of a sudden the U.S. has colonies. We have a sort of island empire in the making. We also have to sort out what to do with Cuba at this point. In between 1898 and 1902, the U.S. Army governs Cuba. Cuba itself sort of descends into chaos for the most part, and so the Army administration works to improve public health, to improve sanitation and education and other things like that. However, it was somewhat in violation of the spirit of the Teller Amendment, the idea that the U.S. would stay out. Troops do eventually withdraw, but under conditions which limit Cuban sovereignty. As the Cubans are writing their constitution, it is required by the U.S. And voiced in what became known as the Platt Amendment that Americans would withdraw only after Cuba agrees not to make any treaty with a foreign power that might limit their independence, not to borrow beyond their means. The U.S. could intervene in Cuba anytime it saw it necessary, and to maintain a naval base there. The Cubans reluctantly agree to this, but it causes quite a deal of resentment among them. So I have another picture here, also from Puck, and it plays on the old cliche of out of the frying pan and into the fire. The frying pan here is represented by the misrule of the Spanish, and the woman representing Cuba, you see her somewhat nervously jumping out of that frying pan and into the fires of anarchy below. And it was a major concern for Americans especially, the idea that Cuba might just devolve into anarchy following independence. And so a lot of this provides the explanation for why the U.S. was reluctant to give up control in Cuba. So now the U.S. has an empire of its own, and of course with that you have people who are opposed to the empire. They were very dismayed by the victories in the Philippines and Cuba, and while the number of these anti-imperialists were few, their influence was great, and in 1898 they formed a group called the Anti-Imperialist League. The idea was that they were upholding the older, more traditional vision of America. They argued that for the United States to rule other peoples was to violate the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. You also have some labor leaders who join in and feared because of their fear that imperial expansion would lead to competition from cheap foreign labor and their products. However, in 1899, the anti-imperialists failed by only a single vote in the Senate to prevent the ratification of the peace treaty with Spain. And so the acquisition of the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico go ahead, basically. But there is a wider question that has to get asked, especially in the Philippines. So, the events that happened in the Philippines following their acquisition by the United States basically confirms all the worst fears of the anti-imperialists. And President McKinley is faced with a dilemma. There's over 5 million people living on the Philippine Islands, and he has to figure out what to do with them now. Victory over Spain, though, whetted the appetite of American expansionists, and the Philippines were seen as a kind of stepping stone to the markets of China. And so, in order to kind of go along with that theme, and probably to assuage his own conscience as well, McKinley reasoned that the Filipinos were unready for civil government and would be gobbled up if they were set adrift in a world of imperial rivals. And he further persuaded himself by saying that American rule would ultimately be beneficial to the Filipinos, calling, in fact, to educate the Filipinos and to uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them. Completely ignoring the fact that the Philippines had been in Spanish control for quite some time, and so were already largely Christianized as a result. This Filipino uprising, or uplifting, ultimately resulted in a Filipino uprising. They weren't really on board with it. A Filipino nationalist by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo, who had already been starting an independence movement to drive out Spain, joined up with the Americans and helped us get rid of Spain in the Philippines. And when the Spanish surrendered, Aguinaldo assumed that the Philippines would be independent. So he declared independence, they started writing a constitution, and ultimately were dismayed when the U.S. agreed to take control of the Philippines. Dismayed and betrayed, Aguinaldo then ordered his rebels to attack Manila and the American base of operations, and it took 70,000 plus U.S. troops to put down the resistance, ultimately resulting in a very long guerrilla conflict. There was a special Senate hearing, basically, on the treatment of Filipinos, on the treatment of prisoners and suspects and burning of villages and things like that. These sort of actions are appalling to us now, but not difficult to understand when taken in the context of the late 19th century. A lot of Americans in the 1880s and 1890s were deeply troubled, especially white Americans, were deeply troubled by these new immigrants from the South and East in Europe, and expressed concern over backward and useless racist attitudes towards Native Americans, towards foreigners, all intermixed with a kind of rhetoric for supervision and stewardship. You see this in the Dawes Act, which affected Native Americans. And you see this a lot even in charity and reform work among immigrants in the cities. All of this sort of well-meaning paternalism ultimately kind of evolves into a domination, and we see that happening in the Philippines very well. The subjugation of the Philippines followed years of expansionism that proclaimed America's debut on the world stage and sort of underscored the global reach of U.S. capitalism. But now the question becomes, is it morally right to acquire the Philippines and to subjugate them to American rule when there's absolutely no intention of making them a state? White Americans were repulsed at the idea of making these barbarian peoples, as they saw them, part of the United States. But then they also didn't find that they were fit to manage their own affairs. And so Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Hawaiians, and Filipinos were all placed in a kind of protective status. They were denied their own independence, but kept under U.S. control with no hope of any sort of actual annexation or statehood. at that point, anyways. And that sort of question is brought up in the picture you see on the slide. You have McKinley over there who's pondering a map showing the Philippine Islands, and the figure of Justice there who's pulling back a curtain and showing the kind of atrocities that happen in the United States. I believe it's something that's supposed to be like a lynching scene in the background. And the caption at the bottom says civilization starts at home. So it's essentially calling hypocrite on the United States. Relations with the Philippines do even out. Congress passes the Philippine Government Act in 1902, which vests authority in a governor general. The governor general chosen was Taft, future President Taft, and he loved the Philippines, he liked the culture, and he got along with the people. He encouraged them to participate in government and actually really helped to smooth relations between the U.S. and the Philippines. So that is chapter 20. I hope that this is useful to you. I hope that this works out. I'll kind of ask you on Tuesday when we get into class how you felt about this and if you think that this is something that we should regularly do with lectures, and then we can use our class period to do other things, perhaps more interesting things. So I hope this really helps, and I wish you all the best luck on your exam. Please remember that you have to have that turned in by Friday night at 11:59, so don't put that off for a long time, and I will see y'all next week. Thanks.